Hi students, so today we are going to introduce Unit 5 which is application layer. So hope you had a clear understanding about the previous four chapters. Now we would see as usual the outline of entire Unit 5. Okay, so in Unit 5 under application layer, the first topic we are going to discuss is DNS, Domain Name System. We will see the more details in the following slides. So let us see quickly what are the topics we are going to study in this unit. The second one is email. Okay, as such now application layer means the user is in interaction with the applications as such. So we are going to see only quite a few applications only, in which email is the first one. The next one is World Wide Web. Okay, in short, we all are familiar with the term WWW, right? So World Wide Web, that is another application we are going to elaborate. And then streaming audio and video. Okay, so nowadays every user wants more of video learning, audio learning, isn't it? So the mode in which the internet nowadays starts functioning has taken totally a new dimension. In that dimension, audio and video streaming has become quite popular. Okay, so then finally content delivery networks. So these are the topics we are going to study in today's class. So let us see each one in detail now. The first one is, as I said, we are now discussing about domain name system, right? In domain name system also quite few topics. One is DNS namespace, how the domain namespace can be done. Okay, so the next one is name servers. There are few servers under this category and we are going to see the details about the name servers. Then working principle of domain name system as such, there is a working principle, and then finally the types of domain servers. Okay, so now before we start this domain name system, let us see what is this domain name system is all about. In Unit 3, what we have studied? We have studied that every host has an IP address, right? If you are talking about IPv4 version 4, then what's happening? You have a 32-bit IP address. Same is the case for the network. We have seen all those things in Unit 3 in detail, right? So, as a human being, we don't feel that convenient to represent any device with its IP address because it's not user-friendly, right? Remembering IP address and then you are communicating with that particular IP address is actually taxing for all of us. Not only that, if this device changes its domain, then what happens? Its IP address again changes. Then you need to remember a new IP address, isn't it? So in that way, it's a long process and quite a hectic process for all of us to adapt. So that is why now we are all familiar with name system. Instead of recognizing any host or a network with its IP address, is there any mechanism in which we can recognize them with the names? That is the concept. So for that purpose, your DNS is going to help you. What basically DNS does is, as the name itself indicates, domain name system. Each host and each network is now here recognized by its name by the user. Okay, each user recognizes either a host or a network with its domain name or with its in terms of name representation. Then we depend on now DNS, domain name system. Then what the domain name system does? It identifies its IP address. Okay, so this process is taking place internally. From user perspective, user is recognizing the devices only with the help of names, which is quite user friendly and easy to adopt. Whereas we are seeking DNS help obviously to convert the domain name in terms of its equivalent IP address. Thereby the communication takes place as such. Okay, so that is the need of a domain name system in application protocol. Okay, as I said earlier, it's quite difficult to remember IP address for n number of hosts, n number of networks. And by chance, if the network or the host changes its domain, obviously its IP address is again changing. And again, to every user, this new change of IP address need to be identified, and it should be noted by all the users, isn't it? In that way, it's quite difficult to remember IP addresses for the users. Then easy to remember domain names due to its hierarchy. If we can represent each IP address with respect to the domain names, then it's quite easy, isn't it? So we adopt that concept to represent hosts as well as networks. Used to translate domain name to IP address. So basically what this domain name system does is it translates, rather it converts. It converts the domain name. Who is giving domain name? As a user, we are recognizing the host with respect to its name, not the IP address. And your system functions only with respect to IP addresses. Then who is doing the intermediate task, converting these domain names with appropriate IP addresses? So domain name system does that task. Okay, so this actually converts each name to its equivalent IP address, right? Refers IP based hosts by domain names and domain names. We see that in detail. Then process of determining IP address for a given host name is actually done by a name resolution. Okay, we call that as a name resolution, and we see the details how actually a resolution is taking place. Okay, so now few more points about it. There are certain protocols need to be adopted, like whenever you are recognizing a device with respect to its name, then there are certain parameters we need to consider. Domain names have elements separated by dots. So that's the first thing. Okay, first domain name followed by a dot, followed by a second domain name, followed by dot, like how we represent our URLs, isn't it? In web browsing, that's the automatically we are doing the concept, isn't it? We are adopting that concept, but maybe we really do not give that much focus on it. So in that sense, every domain name should be separated by dots. That's the first protocol we need to adopt. Good. The rightmost element takes top position in the hierarchy. Okay. So when you are writing your URL, what happens? The rightmost domain that takes the highest priority. Okay. Topmost priority or topmost hierarchy rather. Okay. So that's the second concept. Each element can have maximum of 63 characters. So is there any limitation on the length of your domain name? Yes, obviously there is a limitation. You must have within 63 characters. Okay, your domain name cannot exceed more than 63 characters. That's the third category. Okay, so let us revise quickly. Each domain name is separated by a dot. That's the first condition we need to adopt. How about the second one? The rightmost domain name represents highest in its hierarchy wise. Okay, and the third category is we need to limit your number of characters to 63 as far as your domain name is concerned, right? Good. Then we move on to the domain name space. So this domain namespace is designed to allow hierarchical naming. So whenever we are now, each user cannot give the name of his or her choice, right? There must be one system to adopt, isn't it? And we follow those regulations even in naming certain domains, right? So in that way, designed to allow hierarchical naming. So we need to follow the hierarchy while allowing domain names. Names follow inverted tree structure, right? So what is that? We are going to see in the next block diagram, with root at the top, meaning to say it's an inverted tree structure, right? So you are having the root at the top of the structure, and this root is actually expanding in the form of a tree structure. Now coming to the leaf part, I mean the bottommost part of your tree structure, that represents maybe one organization, maybe one host, maybe one user, like that. Okay, so now the hierarchy is inverted structure. and topmost node represents the highest in hierarchy point of view, right? Then maximum of 128. Since our numbering starts from 0, so 0 to 127 levels is allowed. So in this inverted tree structure, how many levels? Is there any limitation in number of levels? That's also is important. There are maximum 128 levels allowed. Okay, so now generic top level domains. Okay, let us see this quickly before we see the actual structure. So certain wide known domain names. Okay, generic top level domains. What is that? We all know, we type most of the time COM, isn't it? .com. What does the .com domain indicates? And this COM is a rightmost domain name, isn't it? So that, as I said, is the topmost in hierarchy. So it indicates it's a commercial, the shorter notation of a commercial domain. Coming to the second one, EDU. We all know, isn't it? EDU also most of us are using in day-to-day web browsing, right? In typing an URL. So .edu stands for educational institutions. So again, .edu is the rightmost domain name, right? So that also falls under highest priority in terms of hierarchy. Okay. So educational institutions are actually represented by the domain name called edu. Okay, .edu, we put that. Then what's the next one? GOV, government. Okay, so some of the times, you know, you are downloading your so many forms from the government. Then the website or the URL you are typing is .gov, isn't it? If it is a country India, then maybe /in. If it is another country, maybe that is another country's name is coming in there, shorter version of the country's name is coming in there. In that way, the .gov domain name represents government related. Then INT stands for international organizations. In that way, it's just to get an idea, okay? No need to memorize these domain names, just to get a clear picture, because in the following slides, we would be using them quite often as domain names. So without knowing that expansion and it's actually belonging to which domain, it's not appropriate. That's the reason I have given a simple picture here representing the elaboration about each and every domain, right? Then MIL stands for military organizations. Then NET stands for network providers and so on, okay? ORG stands for non-profitable organizations. Even with .org, we have been browsing quite a few times in our day-to-day web browsing. Then AERO stands for air transport. This is business, okay, cooperative, informational, museum, name of the people, okay, professionals, and all these things, okay. This is just for a knowledge point of view, right? Now we move on to the actual domain space, how it's actually implemented. This is how it looks now. How does it look like now? Tell me. As I said earlier, inverted tree structure, and the topmost represents null node. Actually, it's a null node, okay, highest in hierarchy. You can say that as null node. Okay, and again, this is broadly classified into two categories. What are the categories? You can pretty well see that in the diagram, isn't it? One is generic category, okay, generic category, and the other one is with respect to countries, okay. We are talking about World Wide Web, isn't it? Browsing is taking place across globally, isn't it? So in which country, what domain name need to be used also is specified. So in that way, there are two categories under each domain name space. First one is belonging to the generic name and another one belonging to the countries, okay. So now you see here, this is the highest hierarchy-wise highest in terms of the node. Then as you move down in terms of the inverted tree structure, you have again separate domain names. That's the reason I have shown you the previous slide, what each domain name represents actually what, isn't it? So in that way, so commercial, educational, government, military, all those things already we know, isn't it? So in that way, all these domain names represents one particular category. And under each domain now, again it grows like a leaf, isn't it? So again, maybe sun, maybe ENG, okay? It stops there, right? Means this is the user or an organization. if your tree leaf is coming to an end, because it's an inverted tree structure, the bottommost part is considered as a leaf, right? So that is actually either your user, or maybe sometimes it represents an organization as well. Okay. So similarly, under educational, maybe you are representing one university first. It belongs to Yale University. That is the domain name. Then in that, again, you are moving on to the next domain name called Computer Science Department. And in the department, again, you are going for AI, Artificial Intelligence domain. Then again, maybe you are going for a robot particular section of segments. Okay. So that is how these domain names are being allocated, and we follow that structure. Okay. Now, one quick question: how many such, categories, or how many such domain names can be expanded up to? In the previous slide, we already told you the answer: 128. Okay. Since number starts from 0, it's 0 to 127. Okay. Actually, your 0 starts here, and number of divisions can go up to 127. Hope that's clear. And then the other one is actually in terms of countries. Maybe it belongs to US, it belongs to New Zealand. Okay. And again, in New Zealand country, which domain you are talking about? Under the domain, again, what particular section you are talking about? In that way, each and every domain is classified, and each and every domain is separated by what? Dots, right? That's the first slide we're representing. Good. So now we are elaborating that in terms of the points, whatever the diagram we have seen and the explanation I have given. Anyhow, some points wise I'm giving you here so that you can remember these points. A domain name for every node in the tree. Okay. INT is one domain name. Under INT, again, another tree structure. Again, another name for another domain name. Okay. Another domain. In that way, for each and every node, you have a domain name. Okay. Every node is represented by its domain name. Good. Then sequence of labels is separated by dots, right? So this is the main point. Each sequence, each domain should be separated by a dot, right? Then complete domain name comes in that fashion. Then read from the leaf node up to the root. So starting from actually the leaf, because that is the domain name I'm referring to. Actually, I want to refer to robotics in Yale University in Computer Science Department. So the robotic is actual IP address we are referring to. Then you start from bottom end. So it's actually the robotics. It belongs to the Computer Science Department in Yale University. That belongs to obviously to the Yale University Department. It comes under EDU, and then it finally goes to the root hierarchy. Okay. So when you are actually reading the name, you are reading from the leaf perspective. Then label of the root node is null. As I said, it returns no value because it's a null node, right? How we started the inverted tree diagram? A dot. Dot means what? I have already noted down there. It's a null node. It doesn't represent any name there. Okay. So when your search returns no value or null value, means your search is complete. Okay. Good. That is what I'm telling you. Fully qualified domain name. What does it mean? Now, domain names also, there are two categories. The first one is fully qualified domain name. In short, you call it as FQDN. FQDN stands for fully qualified domain name. Okay. If a label is terminated by a null string, this is what I am referring to. What is this null string actually representing? Hierarchical root or hierarchical node, and it doesn't have any name, so it doesn't return you any value. So in that way, if your domain name ends with a null string, means your domain name is called fully qualified. Domain name is fully qualified, means in terms of identifying your domain name, it is successful, right? Good. Then there is another category, partially qualified. Partially qualified means somewhere halfway through your search stops. Maybe from there you need to redo the search again. Okay, your DNS starts identifying the particular IP address for the domain name you have given again one more time, because it hasn't reached until the end point. Okay, if a label is not terminated by a null string, Obviously, if it terminates a null string is case 1, doesn't terminate with a null string is case 2, isn't it? So domain name is called PQDN. Partially only we have identified the particular IP address. Still some more way to go, okay, in order to identify that particular domain name. Okay, good. Now there are 3 types of domains. Now the types of domains we are heading to. As you see, the first one is the generic domain. That's what the diagram shows. The second one is the countries domain. Even that part we have seen. The third part is inverse domains. Okay, inverse domains anyhow we see in the following slides. Hope that is clear. Okay, so now domain names and labels we are continuing. Okay, one simple example we show here how it's actually been done. Now this is the root node. Okay, root node, or sometimes you can call it as null node, right? Null node. So the root doesn't have any name. That's what I mean to say, right? Good. Now actually we are referring to this particular section, and I do not want it to know its IP address. It's quite hectic for a user to remember IP addresses of each and every host or each and every network in that sense. Instead of identifying the hosts or networks with respect to their IP addresses, we wanted to recognize them in terms of their names, right? So when you represent each domain or each host or each network with its domain name, you need to seek somebody's help to convert that into its equivalent IP addresses. That is what we are now referring to, domain name systems. So DMS is taking care of that job for you, right? Now a challenger, okay, challenger node is somewhere deep down in a structure, and that is where I wanted to identify, right? The IP address of that particular node we wanted to identify. So challenger, see now here how it comes. Why I am highlighting that is the rightmost bit domain name is actually having highest hierarchy. Okay, so challenger as such is a segment in a particular domain. And now, okay, so this is the label name. Challenger is a label name of a particular node. Then we are moving on to the top. Actually challenger belongs where? To which department or to which segment it belongs to? Okay, you come to the next in terms of hierarchy, right? It belongs to ATC. Okay, ATC is a segment under which this challenger is a domain name. Then still not clear, right? So then you are still moving up. Then it belongs to FHDA domain, right? And then still not clear. Say for example, then you are moving further up. It comes under EDU domain name. Okay, so EDU is the highest in terms of hierarchy, the rightmost domain name. Now one more thing you must observe here. What is that? Challenger separated by what? Dot, right? Each domain name or each label should be separated by a dot. That's what we have studied today, right? So challenger, this is the first label, first domain name, or the leaf you can say, because the bottommost part of it. Then challenger separated by a dot. It belongs to a domain called ATC. Even that is separated by a dot. Then FHDA is the university name, followed by a dot. Of course, it belongs to educational domain name, right? So this is how domain names and labels actually can be assigned. And believe me, we have been practicing this for quite some time in terms of web browsing, maybe without knowing its protocols. Now by looking at this, now we know actually when you're typing next time, you would know actually in that URL which is having the highest hierarchy and what is the domain name, and all those things actually you can visualize. Now let us see the working of DNS. We have already seen the principles of DNS and actually the function of DNS, right? What is the role of DNS in internet? Domain name system we call it. Domain name system actually resolves the IP addresses of a given domain name. because user does not feel it convenient to recognize either host or networks in terms of their IP addresses. Having studied Unit 3 that each host and network has a specific 32-bit IP address if you are representing it with respect to Internet Protocol version 4. In version 6, even it's quite longer and it's quite inconvenient for user to remember all this number system, right? So instead, we prefer to recognize each and every host as well as network with respect to their names. Thereby, a DNS comes to the existence, and then it takes care of identifying the addresses, right? Let us see how it works now. It is based on client-server architecture, right? Client-server architecture. So basically, DNS architecture is quite similar to that of a client-server model. No centralized, okay? Here no centralized of DNS systems, only distributed. Only distributed concept. Then 4 classes of DNS servers, okay? When you're talking about collection of number of servers, that's what is distributed, we know that, isn't it? Then there are 4 classes of DNS servers. Let us see what are they. One is local DNS server. At each and every local station, you have one DNS server. So we classify that as local DNS server. Then root DNS server. Then TLD, that is top level domain, okay, server. And finally, authoritative domain server. So DNS has to follow certain protocols in order to resolve the IP address associated with that particular domain name. And finally, in this process, if DNS succeeds, then what happens? Authoritative unit, I am the one, okay? So we are searching for that particular host. Then we identified that host. Then what I say, yes, this is my IP address. Authoritatively, we are sending the information back to the DNS. So the final data we receive in that way is classified as authoritative. Sometimes you are unable to recognize up to the user point of view. Then what happens? Maybe the IP address is coming from the cache unit. Okay, don't worry, we see that block diagram, they're easy to understand. Okay, address resolution occurs in 3 steps, okay? Address resolution occurs in the following 3 steps. What is the first one? Resolution cache. Sometimes a quite frequently searched domain names, okay? Maybe we put them in cache memory, isn't it? At each and every domain server, these are the IP addresses very frequently looking for. Then what we do? We keep them in server. Then we really no need to go to the end host, isn't it? From the cache itself, the DNS retrieves the IP address of a given domain name. Under that category, we classify that as resolution has taken place at the cache level. We don't call it as authoritative. Authoritative takes place only when you reach the actual endpoint, and the endpoint is giving you its IP address with the corresponding domain name. Only in that case, we call that as authoritative. Okay. Else, somewhere at intermediate cache level itself, we are resolving its IP address. Then that category comes under resolution at cache level. Then host file. Okay, now what happens is when DNS, domain name system, is trying to identify the IP address with a given domain name, then in return, what the host is actually sending, along with its IP address, it also sends a file with certain few details in that. Is it okay? So we classify that as a host file. Then local DNS server. Sometimes you would be able to get its IP address from the local DNS server itself. We need not to really go till the endpoint and then get the actual IP address associated with the particular user, right? So in that way, there are few cases. Okay, 2 mechanisms for address resolutions, and what are they? Now we are going to see. In this, while resolving these addresses, how many kinds of mechanisms are possible? There are only two types, okay? The first one is recursive resolution, and the second one is iterative resolution. How it's been done? Let us see that in detail now. Okay, so before going to the actual resolutions methods, let us see the working of DNS now. As I said, this is a user program. Maybe you can say as a host, I'm the user program now, maybe a host. He has only a domain name now. Wanted to know its IP address. Good. Then request is sent. What input we have at the moment? Domain name. User program has a given domain name as its input. Now what user program is expecting in return? Written in terms of the IP address associated with the domain name. Is that clear? Every user program recognizes each and every host or each and every network with respect to their names, not IP addresses, because that's easy to adopt. However, things do not function in that way. You need to, even though we write programming in high-level language, say for example, computers do not understand high-level language program. What we need to do then? Then you choose either a compiler or an interpreter to convert that into a machine language. Then only the processor can understand a series of zeros and ones, right? So we writing, as a human being, writing a programming in terms of machine language is quite obsolete. We would not be able to recognize that fast, isn't it? So thereby you adopt a culture which is quite easy for us or user friendly. So we try to develop programming in either assembly language or in high level language programming. Then we seek certain software help to convert these programs into the understanding language of the computers. In a similar way, names are not being recognized by the World Wide Web. Each host or each network has a specific or a unique IP addresses associated with them. As a user, for us it's quite difficult to adopt that culture. So what we are trying to do is we are recognizing them with respect to their names, and we are seeking the help of DNS to resolve its address. So as a user, now I have an input in terms of a domain name. Then it goes to the resolver. Resolver will find its equivalent IP address, right? Sometimes, as I said, if this is quite frequently searched domain name, then they are available inside the cache at the DNS client. Then straight away it reads from there, it saves, and it gets you immediately. So here the search has not gone to the end level, right? So this is the second category. Okay, we don't have that in cache. Maybe it's a new name, domain name, and we don't have that equivalent IP address in the cache. Then your search is not complete. It hasn't resolved yet. So your resolver still proceeds. It goes to the DNS server. That is a local host, local DNS server, right? And obviously you are getting a response now. Then that response is transferred to the user program. Is it clear? This is how a simple function of a DNS. This is how a DNS works. It takes an input from a user program in the form of a domain name. Then a section of DNS is actually a resolver. Resolver is trying to resolve the IP addresses of given domain name. Sometimes resolver will identify that from the given cache level itself, and this happens most of the time is the domain name is quite frequently searched. Usually under cache, that's what we store, isn't it? Quite frequently used instruction or quite frequently used IP address. That's what is stored inside the cache. Not necessarily all the time you find those things in the cache. Then you proceed further. Then you get it from the actual DNS server. Then its equivalent IP address is actually sent back to the user program. Good. Then there are two types of mechanisms. That's what we studied in the previous slide, isn't it? One is recursive resolution. The other one is iterative resolution. There are two types of mechanisms in which the resolver identifies the IP address. Okay, well, again, quite easy to understand. Now we have a source side here, and maybe this is the destination side. Until the actual IP address is identified, there is no feedback to the source. If your search is continuing in that fashion, then we categorize that as recursive resolution. Okay, so now I wanted to identify the IP address of a given domain name. Then what happens as a user program? I am initiating the task of sending with respect to TCP protocol, okay, the domain name to the DNS unit. Then what the DNS unit is doing, we have seen in the previous slide, it has a resolver, right? And sometimes it may be looking initially at the cache level. It doesn't get it from there. Then it proceeds further to the server level in that way. Now, each and every unit inside the host will not get any feedback from the domain name system until the final IP address is identified. So it sends the signal. From there, it goes to the destination, and then at the destination level, maybe it goes to few stages, and then finally identifies the IP address, and then the information is sent back. The information is sent back. What I mean to say is, there is no intermediate information sent to the host unit. If your resolving in DNS is taking place in this fashion, then that kind of mechanism is classified as recursive resolution. Okay, but some may not prefer that. You know why? Maybe it takes a long time to take place. So you are not getting any feedback. You are feeling that what's happening? Is it the process going on smoothly, or is the process in the right direction to identify the IP address? Like that, some people prefer an intermediate feedback halfway through whenever it is possible, isn't it? That is the case is iterative resolution. Okay, the EDU domain name is identified. Now we are moving further to what university it belongs to. Yeah, it belongs to Yale University. Again, you are getting another feedback from there. Then yes, in the Yale University it belongs to computer science department. Yes, again you are getting a feedback to the user program. Then finally the actual challenger or whatever is also identified under the CS department. Then also you get the feedback. So at each and every domain node, some sort of feedback is also sent to the host. If your resolution is taking place in this fashion, then we categorize this resolution as iterative resolution. Okay, maybe I can give one simple example for that. Again, in terms of your programming languages, when we write the programming in high-level language, we are seeking either an interpreter or a compiler software to convert that into machine language, isn't it? Okay, now why you are talking about two softwares here? One is compiler, you are telling, the other one is interpreter, you are telling. Both of them are doing the same task. How they are doing? Like how one is recursive resolution, the other one is iterative resolution. Okay, what compiler does? Compiler reads the entire high-level language program. Maybe your program has 25 instructions. Then it reads all the 25 instructions one shot, of course sequentially. Then upon completion of reading all these instructions, it starts converting them into machine language. In a similar way, your resolution is starting. It goes until the end point whose domain name is actually given. Upon identifying its IP address, the information is sent back to the user program. Upon reading the complete all the number of instructions in a given program, your compiler starts converting the programming in machine language. This is one way of converting. What's another way? Interpreter, what it does? It reads the first instruction. Maybe you have 25 instructions in your high-level language program, and it starts converting that instruction as it is into machine language. Then it goes to the next instruction, starts converting that into machine language. In a similar way, here at each and every, if possible, not necessarily, if whenever there is some feedback can be given at a given domain name, that feedback is also sent to the user program. So this is how these two mechanisms can be understood. Hope that's quite clear now. Okay, so now we are moving on to the assignment part. So we have completed domain name systems, and what kind of questions can be actually asked from this particular unit of your, can be seen in the form of assignments here. What is the purpose of domain name system? Very simple and straightforward question. What's the need of it? Okay, why do we need domain name system as such, and what does it do? The basic explanation there. Then discuss the three main divisions of domain name space. Those divisions also are there in the slides, so then easy to explain that. And explain about iterative and recursive resolutions. That's what we have seen in the towards the end of those slides. Iterative resolution and recursive resolutions. There are two categories, rather two mechanisms you call it. Okay, explain them in brief point of view. Okay, so with that we finished the domain name systems. So now we are moving on to the next part, which is classified as part 2 in application layer. Okay, now we go straight away to the actual applications now. What is the first application we are talking about? Email. Okay, see, most of us are using that. Maybe we do not know the protocols adopted in emails, but we are quite popular in using them. But this is the time now for us to identify in terms of its infrastructure, in terms of its architecture, and what kinds of protocols does an email need, and how this process is taking place, all those things, right? Okay, actually one of the application as such a user adopts at application layer is email, right? For mail, so electronic mail service. So what are the services your email provides? The overall outline we are now looking into. Second one, user agent. Okay, we call that one in short as UA, user agent. What all the services the user agent actually has? Okay, to make it quite simple, user agent is nothing but you as a user. Okay, so now I'm going to write an email. I become the user agent, right? With the help of certain software or with the help of certain infrastructure, I wanted to write an email. Then I become a user agent. Okay, the user as such is named as user agent. Then what are the formats that are available in a given email application? Then mine, multi-purpose internet message extensions, we call it. Okay, so don't worry too much. Maybe when in the following slides we see them in detail. Then email architecture. So basically what's the architecture we adopt in email application. So this is what we are going to study in this lecture class. Okay, electronic mail is the actual name of email, and what are the features email has. Okay, let us see the features first. Then as we move forward, we see more into its architecture and its formats, its addresses, all those things. Okay, it's a network application. Email is a network application, right? Isn't it? Self-explanatory as such, right? Extremely faster than normal postal system. That's also self-explanatory. Earlier to emails, what we have, a normal postal service, right? You drop a letter, then that letter is actually traveling from the source to the destination with some sort of transportation, and then one particular postal person is involved in delivering that to the destination. So that is how we used to send messages earlier. Even now some we do that, but electronic mail is totally a new method, okay, where the message is transferred instantaneously. Okay, sometimes you can call in that way. So in that way, when you're comparing, it's extremely faster when you compare with the conventional postal mechanism, right? Easy to use, quite easy to use. We no need to travel, go by the nearby post office and then drop the letter there and make sure, a proper stamp is attached to the letter and all those things. That kind of, hectic tasks are no more involved. You're just sitting at your home, you open your laptop, you have a email, user program. With that user program, you are able to send it instantaneously. It's quite user friendly as well as easy to use. So that's one major function or major feature, right? Asynchronous mode of communication. Okay, this I think by now, being an electronics engineers, you know what is asynchronous mode. Okay, synchronous mode means both the user and sender are active at the same time. Does it happen in that way, your email system? No, isn't it? I am sending an email. Maybe at a later point of time, maybe the other destination user would open that email and read, or maybe would receive that email. There is some delay. Okay, so in that way, whenever the communication is taking place in this way, you call that mode of communication as asynchronous. So obviously, email comes under asynchronous mode of communication. Good. Then one-to-many transfer. Okay, one-to-many transfer. Even that one is also available in normal postal system. But you need those many copies. But here, no need. You add those many addresses, or you send a group message, then email is sent to many users one shot. Okay, in that way it's quite versatile. One to many, that is one of the major feature. Treated as more complex, okay, in terms of programming or in terms of the design of a user programming perspectives. Obviously this is more complex. Okay, email features we have seen, and all these features are self-explanatory. Most of us know that already. Now we go for services. What kind of services an email application has? Good. Now attachments. Okay. What attachments you're talking about? An email can have a document as an attachment, another text file. Okay. Or an email can have a video file as an attachment. So here now we are talking about multimedia, right? Email has a video clip attached to it, so that is an attachment. Or email can have an audio file as an attachment. In that way, there are number of, upon identifying MIME. So anyhow, we haven't started about that extensions, multi-purpose internet message extensions we call it. Upon identifying MIME, the number of attachments, of the types of attachments that can be attached to an email has seen totally a new perspective. Earlier, before identifying MIME, most of the attachments are confined to only text based. Okay, good. Then that's our attachment. Then filtering, sometimes spam, right? We are all very familiar with that name. Maybe we are getting an unnecessary message from an unnecessary user. Okay, that message is not at all intended to the given recipient. Then we have certain filtering mechanism in email systems, right? Obviously, this email system recognizes this as a spam email and obviously directly directs that to a spam folder, or sometimes even does not accept that email at all. Okay, so in that way, a filtering concept is quite popular in this email systems. That's one of the features, right? Services. Then CC, without knowing, sometimes some of us may not be knowing the actual expansion of it, but we put CC. What is the CC means? Carbon copies. That is how the name comes. Okay, you send the CC to, I send the email to the head of the department. Have you sent the CC to the concerned lecturer also? We are talking like that, isn't it? But maybe most of us really do not know what is the expansion of that CC. Okay, now we are able to recognize that with a proper abbreviation. CC stands for carbon copies of messages. Along with the actual recipient, we are also sending a carbon copy of that message to another recipient, and which we do generally in today's day-to-day emails. Then another one is BCC, okay, another option, right? What is that? Blind carbon copies, okay, blind carbon. Send it to the entire organization employees, okay. Then what happens? BCC, when it is sent to each and every employee of a given organization, a blind copy to August 2nd, is a public holiday. Then the university administration wanted to convey that message to all the employees in the university. Then what they do, they send a BCC to all the employees. So that's another feature, right? Then store and manage mails through mailboxes. Now what happens, like you get n number of messages from n number of senders. Then is there any mechanism? Can I store these mails in a given order or in a given fashion? Yes, there's one mailbox. Okay, you create folders in mailboxes and categorize the emails based on their category, right? It belongs to educational category. Then you open one folder under that. Whatever the emails you receive from the university, you put it in that folder. Maybe you receive messages from your friends, then you create another folder called friends, and then you organize all the emails receiving from friends into that subfolder. In that way, it can be stored and managed quite efficiently in the form of mailboxes. One-to-many transfer. Of course, that we have already seen even in the previous slide under features. One email can actually be transferred. There is one forward option also there, or you can use either CC or BCC options, and that mail can be sent to n number of users at a time. And in fact, there are quite a few services. Some of the most widely used services were shown there. Then enabling email services. How to enable these services? Okay, who is actually looking after the task? Okay, as I said, enable using two basic components. Two basic components. What are they? One is user agent. As I said earlier, who is user agent? Mail reader, okay, or the mail sender, okay, they are the user agents. I want to send an email to head of the department regarding particular scenario, then I become a user agent, isn't it? Then the other end, upon receiving the mail, maybe the head of the department is opening that email and going to the mail, then he becomes a user at the other end. So in that way, the actual users are classified as user agents, or here we say mail reader. Okay, mail reader is the actual name is user agent. Then another one is message transfer agent. Now what happens, I have written an email in the form of a text, then this message is not sent as it is, you know that, right? Then obviously what happens, this message need to be converted into a network protocol model, and that message is transferred. So somebody who is converting that message into another form of the form to send it from sender to the receiver, who is doing that job? Message transfer agent. And we call this in short as MTA. Okay, one is user agent as such, the other one is message transfer agent. Okay, the unit which is responsible to transfer the message from sender to the recipient. Good. Now we focus more on what UA, that is user agent. What are the services user agent has? Okay, good. Easy to understand, isn't it? So this is the mail reader. Okay, what he can do, he can compose a message. That's what, composing a message. A new email is written. Not only that, he received a mail from someone else, so he can read that message also. If you want to reply, then reply that message to the given sender, then forward the message to someone else. Okay, you feel that this should be forwarded to your higher authority, then you forward that. Then handling mailboxes. Then finally what you wanted to do, you wanted to store that in a particular subfolder, then move it to that particular subfolder. Okay, not only all this, there are quite a few of this. Okay, in fact even a lot more tasks can be done by a user agent. All of them are services provided to the user agent. Okay, some of very widely commonly used services are highlighted here. Okay, Is that clear? A user agent is nothing but the mail reader. What are all the services the user agent is capable of? This slide explains that a user agent can compose a mail. A user agent can read a mail, reply to a mail, forward that mail to someone else, and then handle mailboxes, organizing the mails in a structured fashion. Good. And still we are continuing with that concept. A local program or software package, that's what he needs to do all these tasks, right? A local program, because at the user end, to perform all these tasks, he must have a program for that, isn't it? Facilitating the user agent with all these features. Or you call it as a software package. Sometimes it's a package. Sometimes it's a simple program as such. It depends on what type of email application you have at the user end. Services provided by the user agent. Okay, so we have seen that in the form of a block diagram in the previous slide. Now we are now putting that in point form in this slide. What are they? Read, send, compose, forward, reply to a given mail. These are all the services. And then, of course, handle mailbox. Handle mailbox. All those things we have already seen, right? Good. Then composing messages. How does a user agent composes a message? Clicking on compose, of course, we all know that something like, which we have been doing in day-to-day life, but we are now studying that application in a more structured format. So in that way, believe me, this is one of the easiest topic you can ever think of, because we have been doing it in everyday's life, right? And now we are studying in more structured way. Okay. Clicking on compose invokes user agent. When you wanted to compose a mail, what you do? Obviously, you go and click on compose mail on a given user program or a software package. Then it provides you a template. Then that is the location where you start typing the message, right? Then reading messages. In order to read messages, what you do? Of course, you already know. User agent is triggered by the timer, okay? The timer or user, and allows us to open incoming mails. Nowadays, you have a notification, right? You have the beeping sound, or you have some timer which is making you to realize that there is a mail in your inbox automatically. If you are of interest to open that email, you are just opening that email and reading, right? So that's how you read the message. One-line summary of each received mail containing 5 fields. Okay, this 5 is now more commonly adopted. If you are going for a high-end, it can be even more. Okay, what are the 5 fields? I think we just follow this method from exam point of view. We are not talking about very high-end, email software packages. More widely used one has 5 fields. Okay, what are they? One is number field. Number field. What is this number? Hey, nothing but like your serial number. How many emails I have in my mailbox? There must be a number system, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 120 mails in my mailbox. So the first category is number field. Okay, number field is nothing but number associated with the number of mails you are receiving. Then flag. What is this flag? Flag, as I said, is quite popular name for us, isn't it? Whether it belongs to a priority, means it's coming highest priority email. Then you have that symbol set. Okay, maybe a normal mail. Then that flag is option there. So in that way, to differentiate, the importance of a mail, a flag field is set. Sometimes it's a highest priority email received from my head of the department. So all of us will open that email first and maybe open other emails later and go through that highest priority email, isn't it? So that location is represented as flag field. Then message size. What is the size of this email? You know that very well, isn't it? 1 KB, maybe 5 kilobytes, maybe 1 megabyte. So the size of the mail as such is another category, right? Then sender, from whom you are receiving that email. Obviously, there should be a field associated with that. So a sender name, okay? Then subject. Subject is also very important, and then subject is also included as another field, okay? So in that way, there are 5 fields, right? One is number field, just denotes how many number of emails you have in your mailbox. Second one is a flag field. Are you assigning any priority to any particular email? That's what this flag field is representing. Then message size, the size of the message as such. Then sender, who is sending that message, you know? And then finally, on what subject the sender is sending you the message. So these are all the 5 fields. Okay, that's all. Next one is replying to messages. We have seen how to compose a message. We know that very well. We have also seen how to read a message and what all the fields associated with each message. And finally, replying to messages. Okay, how do we reply? Clicking on reply, as simple as that. Clicking on reply, then immediately it invokes your user agent software. Okay, allows to reply to original sender or all recipients to whom all you wanted to reply. We are doing it as day-to-day activities, right, isn't it? So in a similar way, either you reply to the particular sender or a group of your colleagues. Provides quick reference keeping original and new message in reply message. Okay, so this is another way. You don't want to reply from there, then you wanted to open another composed mail and then reply from there. Also, even that option is also possible. Okay, so then forwarding a message. What is the next task? Forward. I receive a mail. I thought that this information should be shared with my colleagues also. Then what I'm doing is just forward that email as such to a new receiving person. Okay, allows user to forward message. As such, you're forwarding it to someone else. Difference between replying and forwarding. Okay, obviously there's a difference, isn't it? You're replying means you're actually replying to that particular mail. Come and see me. That's the email I'm getting from my head of the department. Then immediately I'm replying, yes sir, I'm coming. So this is the way you reply. Tomorrow is so-and-so event. I'm receiving one message from the head of the department. Then what I'm doing is I'm forwarding that message to my colleagues. So that is how you differentiate forwarding and replying, isn't it? We know that already, isn't it? Then handling mailboxes. I told you, right? Sometimes you wanted to organize your mailbox in a more structured way. From whom all you are receiving under one subfolder, what type of message under another subfolder. In that way, you are organizing your mailbox. Creates 2 mailboxes. One is inbox, the other one is outbox. Subfolders, again, you can actually categorize under that later. Okay, inbox is one mailbox where all the incoming mails are stored. Okay, outbox is another one where all the mails you sent, a copy is stored. Okay, that's the way. Then types of user agents. How many types of user agents are available? Good. It's a good question, isn't it? Command driven. Command driven. Before, GUI based, whatever we are applying today or whatever we are using today, that comes under the second category, GUI based, right? Where you use Outlook Express or maybe a Netscape email service provider, and then you're opening that software, and from that software you are sending mails or receiving mails. Earlier to that, it's command driven, means DOS based commands. But they are no more, outdated almost. One is Spine, the other one is ELM. Okay. The text, there's a simple like commands, for each text there's a separate command associated with that. and believe me, they're almost outdated. If you wanted to know this may be an expansion of electronic mail, short form for electronic mail. Okay, mail. EL stands for electronic, M stands for mailing, and I want a different. Okay, Pine. A different name. Pine is actually as such, no abbreviation for that, and they are DOS based message email systems, and those emails are actually with the help of DOS commands. For each message you are actually typing a command, and that was the older version. Then it's time to move for format. Is there any format we need to adopt while sending emails? Yes, of course, there's a standard format. What you are seeing here, good. So this is a normal postal type. Okay, postal, comparing with that, and this is an email type. Okay, this is an electronic mail on B, and A is a postal mail. So how do you write a letter in a postal mail? The structure is given, right? So first one is envelope. How we are classifying them, you see? Envelope. So you write a letter on a white paper, and that letter is folded accordingly and put inside an envelope, right? On top of the envelope, what you do? You write the recipient's address, to whom you are sending this letter, right? So you need to write the address. So and so place, so and so country, so and so pin code. So a complete address of the recipient is written on an envelope. The same structure is followed here as well. We also in electronic mail have an envelope, and for that envelope, from who is the sender, the mail, and to whom you are sending, who is the recipient. Okay, here they have a specific email address, but here you have a normal postal address. Both of them are represented as envelope in both the cases. Coming to the next one, header. Okay, even in normal postal mail you have a header. Even in electronic mail as well you have header, right? Meaning to say, the first one is envelope, the second one is actually the message. Message is classified into two subcategories again. The first category is named as header, the second category is named as body, and we have same method in both postal as well as electronic mail. Okay, now see what is the header under message in normal postal method. We are writing again some short form, right? So and so. Then subject, you are talking about network. Then actual content you are writing. In a similar way, header includes some control information. From whom, so and so, to whom, again, and what date it's written, and what subject actually this email belongs to. And sometimes even it may have few more fields depending upon the type of the user agent software. Okay, and then later, so this is actually classified as header under message. Classified as header under message category. Then once header is gone, then actually what is left out? The actual content, what you wanted to inform. That is what is actually classified under body. So this is how an email format looks like. It's actually derived from the conventional postal format. When sending mail, now how do you send it? Of course, we all know that mail is created by user agent. We understand this already. Mail is created by the user agent with the help of the user agent software with two parts. What are they? Just now we saw the diagram, isn't it? The first part is called envelope. The second part is called the message. Again, the message is classified into two subcategories. One is header and the body. Next one is called the body, right? So overall classification is actually two. One is envelope the other one is message. Okay, now you talk about the envelope. Sender and receiver's addresses are available on envelope. This is the conventional method we adopt even in normal postal message systems. Then coming to the message. Message as such, as I told you, it has two subcategories. The first category is called as header. Even in header, there is a standard way in which you maintain a header. Senders details, receivers details, and other control information. Maybe sometimes you are including date. At what time this email is sent, on what date this email is sent, like that. Okay. Then later body. Body is the actual information the sender wants to convey to the recipient. Okay. Then again there are two parts in an address. Two parts in an address. What are they? The first one is the local part. The second one is the domain name. In local part, received mail stored for retrieval by MAA. What does that mean? Mail access agent. Mail access agent. Domain name, second one, right? Assigned to mail server that comes from DNS database. Okay? Under what server you are actually downloading your message. Like that. Okay, then email address continued. So this is how the email address looks like, and we all know that already. One is the local part at domain name, isn't it? Ramanamurthy at Vijnana University, right? Ramanamurthy is the local host. At, he belongs to which domain? He belongs to Vijnana University's domain. So in that way, okay? Address of the mailbox on the mail server. So whenever you receive a mail from me, you see Ramanamurthy, right? So in that way. And whenever you see the domain, you see the domain of the name of the mail server. It's coming from vijnan.edu.in server, like that. Okay? So then, yes, I told you something like MIME, isn't it? Upon invention of MIME, the nature of attachments that can be attached with an email has taken a new perspective, isn't it? Earlier, only documents and certain forms of other forms of documents are only allowed as attachments. Upon MIME, okay, it has taken a new dimension. Good. Email sends messages only in 7-bit ASCII format. Beautiful, right? Now we are talking more technically. Email sends messages only in 7-bit ASCII format. For each alphabet, we have a 7-bit ASCII representation, code representation. So that is how the text messages were converted and sent from sender to the recipient. Okay? Email cannot send audio and video earlier. Okay? Of course, now we are able to see all that because of MIME. Okay? MIME, already I told you, isn't it? Multi-purpose internet mail extensions is a complete expansion of MIME. And with this, we are able to introduce several forms of attachments as well, along with your message. Okay, so software functions of it. MIME transforms non-ASCII data to ASCII data. Good. That is the reason why you could actually attach an audio file now. Audio file is not with the extension of ASCII anymore, isn't it? For each character, if it is a text message, there is a 7-bit ASCII character conversion. But when you're talking about an audio message or a video message, then how this ASCII methodology is adopted there, it becomes automatically a non-ASCII mode, isn't it? So you must have certain system now which converts a non-ASCII also in terms of ASCII code conversion. If you can do that, obviously this audio file also can be attached, Obviously, this video file also can be attached, and different even other formats of messages can be attached. MIME transforms non-ASCII data to ASCII data. That is the reason why now your dimension has taken a new perspective. Non-ASCII data given to MIME through user agent and converted into ASCII goes to MTA. Where it goes? Mail transfer agent. So mail transfer agent, user agent is one who is writing the mail, and the mail transfer agent is another system which is transferring the mail from source to the destination, right? See now how it looks like. User and so you have user agent, a non-ASCII code, right? Non-ASCII code. Now I want an audio file as an attachment, right? Or maybe I want a video file as an attachment, some other form of a file which is not coming under ASCII mode. Okay? So, MIME I'm calling now. Because of invention of MIME, a non-ASCII code can be converted to 7-bit ASCII code. Then it goes to the mail transfer agent. Then the same format is going to the recipient end of mail transfer agent. Then after that, again this goes to the MIME, and then at the receiving end he gets the audio file as it is. So in fact, the data transfer is always taking place with respect to the ASCII code. However, we are adopting a new protocol or a new system called MIME system, which is an actually extension files can be interlinked, okay, with that way. So now what's the outlook of MIME is, MIME adds its 5 header fields to our original mail header, okay, and what are they? One is MIME version, which type of version you are using, that's the first header. Then the content type, what type of content you are sending. Yes, this is a video file, video content, or maybe audio file. What type of content you are sending as an attachment, that is the second category. Okay, defines the type of data used in the body of the message, right? Then it's shown like this, content type is shown like this. You need to remember that format, okay? Content type is like type/subtype with parameters, okay? Then content transfer encoding. Sometimes I'm sending a confidential information, right? Anybody cannot open that video file without that encoding known to them, okay? Security aspects. Defines the method used to encode the message. Sometimes a high encoding you are using in order to introduce the security to your message or your attachment as such. The message into zeros and ones for transport. Defines the method used to encode the messages into zeros and ones for the real transportation, okay? Then the content, transfer, encoding, and what type is used, what kind of encoding mechanism is adopted in this attachment. And the next one is content ID. Every content has a specific ID, okay? This is later something gone wrong, then with the help of this ID you are able to retrieve. So ID is something like, for every mail you have a number, serial number. In that way, for every MIME you have a content ID. Identifies uniquely among multiple messages, okay? Because I wanted to trace out one particular message, then without having a content ID, it's quite difficult, isn't it? So in that way, for every message there's a content ID, and this is the format we follow for that. ID equals to content ID. Then content description defines whether the body is image, audio or video. Actual description of the content, right? Then that is actually shown like this with the help of a description. Then data types and subtypes in MIME. This is actually for knowledge sake, okay? No need to memorize them to get a picture what type of data types MIME supports, to get to know, okay? A text. If the type is text, what are the types of text supported by MIME is shown here. It supports a plain text, HTML text, hypertext markup language, or mixed type, even that one it supports, okay? Then multi-part, this parallel and digest, this is another subtype. Then message as such. These are the types of the messages your MIME supports, okay? Then image, JPEG and GIF. These are the types of the images. Then video, MPEG, okay? Then audio, basic audio types. Then application is PostScript and Octet. Stream. Then next one is types of content transfer encoding. Again, there are certain things. One is what type and what description you are talking about. Okay, the 7-bit, sometimes even 8-bit, sometimes even binary. Okay, a stream of data. Then this ASCII conversion doesn't, holds good. Then you are sending a stream of data in terms of binary as such. Non-ASCII characters with unlimited length of bits. Then base 64 is even longer blocks of your data, 6-bit blocks of data encoded into 8-bit ASCII characters. Then quoted printable. So these are all the types of contents. Okay. Then email architecture. Arriving at common email architecture through 4 scenarios. In fact, it's quite easy, okay? Nothing to panic too much. How this email architecture is actually visualized in 4 scenarios. And the first scenario we are seeing a very simple way, isn't it? So what's happening? UA stands for user agent. Now, Alice is the user agent here. So on his laptop or desktop, he opens a user agent software or a program, then types the message, types the email. Then it is sent to the system, okay, through MTA. Message stands for agent. Then the system sends it to the recipient user agent called Bob. A very simple scenario. This is one basic architecture, okay, which is classified as a first scenario. Any doubt there? Clear, isn't it? We have at the sending end one user agent, and we have a system, and at the receiving end we have a recipient user agent. The second scenario, what happens now is, again a user agent called Alice. Then in the previously there is no message transfer agent involved, okay? Only now it's coming into picture. Now system mail server. Now I'm sending an email from Vignan mail server, okay? Vignan University's mail server. Then you have a message transfer agent. That message transfer agent, upon reviewing the mail, allows that onto the internet. Okay, now the internet, there is a data transfer protocol is used. Then at the receiving end, again there is an MTA server, system mail server, receives it, and then that mail is forwarded to the receiving user end. That comes under second scenario, where MTAs are involved and the message email is sent across zones in the form of internet. And the third scenario, now what happens is, even at the sender end, you have a network to connect to your MTA. Earlier it was directly physically connected, right? Now through a wireless connection, maybe either a LAN or a WAN type of connection. So then only MTA server is connected to the user agent. Then again the same process. After this, the process is quite identical to that of the second process. Then the MTA forwards that over internet through data transport protocols, and then at the receiving end, upon verifying again, it goes to the user end at the destination. Okay, then the fourth scenario. So at both the ends, this is the sender user agent, receiving user agent, both are connected to the MTAs through network, either LAN or WAN. Okay, so this is the longest possible scenario. Is that clear? There are four various scenarios. Okay, now next one is SMTP. SMTP is an MTA. Okay, what is an SMTP? Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. So as I said, mail transfer, we are transferring the mail from one place to another place. So there should be a protocol adopted in that, right? So SMTP is the protocol for that. So SMTP is basically a mail transfer agent. The actual mail transfer, who is responsible of mail transfer from source to the destination, is MTA, message transfer agent. Okay, system should have client MTA and server. Client MTA and server, right? MTA for sending mail. MTA is actually doing what? Sending mail and receiving mail respectively. Looks envelope and does message transfer using commands. As simple as that. Okay. See now here, MTA client, message transfer agent client, and sends commands, and message transfer agent responds. What's the range of this SMTP? To what extent it can be extended? It's quite easy again. SMTP, this is the sender, user agent sender, connected via LAN or WAN to the mail server. Then the other end of the mail server is connected via internet working. Then again this mail server is also connected via LAN or WAN to the other recipient. Okay, so this is where your SMTP comes into picture. Simple mail transfer protocol. And that one can be done with few commands. Okay, and these commands also, as I tell you, no need to memorize. Okay, that is just to get some idea about it. So the simple commands like hello to find out, greeting message, then mail from, who is the sender, and recipient, what kind of data you are sending. Okay, these options quit and reset are not there. Verify, no operation, turn, okay, mailing list, command name, intended recipient, and all that. Okay, these are all the types of SMTP commands, and as I said, that's only for knowledge point of view. Then again, some responses. For each response is a code associated with it. Then you know what's the problem, isn't it? System status or help reply or help message. For each one, there's a code associated with SMTP protocol. Good. And IMAP Pro. Okay. These are the protocols, and believe me, POP3 is almost outdated. That's quite identical to post office protocol, right? And it's almost outdated. And now Internet Message Access Protocol IMAP 4 is more widely used. And how they are used actually can be seen here. POP3 and IMAP. And as I said, in POP3, what happens is once the message is downloaded by this user in server, it's actually deleted by mistake. Upon downloading, if the file is corrupted or you deleted the message, there is no way you can retrieve actually with the POP3 method. Okay, because upon downloading the email from the mail server, automatically server deletes it. That's one good way of maintaining server, not to overload. But in IMAP, you still maintains a copy of it. So if by chance if you miss an email, you would be still able to receive that. Okay, so in that way, IMAP is more widely adopted method protocol now at the mail receiving end to download the mail. Okay, so with that now we move on to the assignment. Whatever the topics we have studied in email, what kind of questions actually can be asked under this application? Very simple and straightforward questions. Okay, what are the different types of message formats used in email? Very simple and straightforward, isn't it? The second one, how does MIME enhances SMTP? Okay, what is the difference between user agent and message transfer agent? So these are all actually straightforward questions. Okay, so with this we finish second part and application layer. In later part we move on with the other topics, continuing with other topics. Okay, so if you have any doubts, please do send me an email. As I've been telling you quite a few times, I would be very happy to extend my lecture sessions or wherever some additional information is needed. I would be very happy to help you in that regard. Okay, thank you. See you all again.